Bonjour, and welcome back to Vox Terra. You may have heard about some massive truck rallies in Ottawa that have congested traffic and shut down the city, the capital of Canada. You may have heard reports about horns blaring and children not being able to get any sleep. I read one in CBC about people who wear masks getting harassed and swastikas and Confederate flags flying. Well, you may know initially we heard in the media reports this was a truck driver rally. By truck driver, I mean actual trucks, people who are shipping across borders, protesting the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. Well, who'd want to get a shot if they don't want to get a shot? But notice one, it's a lot of non-semi-tractor trailers in there. There's also pickup trucks. And then recently I was reading an article on, I think, Mother Jones about calls online to have mom vans or something like that join in. So you got pickup trucks, or they're not hauling across the border. Make a note of that in your head, in your cabeza. So if you are into this and you think you're a part of this freedom convoy, or you're against it and you're trying to make sense out of it, either way, I'm going to help you make sense out of this. So conspiracy theory, if we want to call it that, really it's just conspiracy ideas are so popular right now because a lot of people have a sense like, you know what, something's wrong. I can sense something's wrong. And it does feel that way, like something's wrong and the media isn't telling us. And that feels correct. That is true. But it's a little different. It's actually a lot different than these so-called conservative right-wing media outlets are telling their fans. Now, I always say so-called because you don't hear me disparaging conservative as an identity. You don't hear me disparaging left. People have sincere reasons for feeling a certain identity. So when I'm telling you these media outlets are leaving out, I'm talking about I'm putting forward a conspiracy for conspiracy. Let's look at it this way. If you were, say, in the fossil fuel industry, or you're reckless, you just want to keep that money train going. If you were in, say, the auto industry, if you were in, say, the pharmaceutical industry, and you were saying, how can we get people to willingly stand up and for more fossil fuel burning and to spread a disease? How could you do that? Well, you'd tell them what? What would you tell them? You tell them they're standing up for burning fossil fuels and spreading a disease? No. You tell them you're standing up for, say it with me, freedom. You're standing up for freedom. That's what you tell them, isn't it? So before I even get into funding sources and all that kind of stuff, let's just start with what I believe. And if you're watching Fox or you're listening to Breitbart or whatever these outlets are, and I got it wrong, and they are highlighting these things, you let me know. I'm happy to hear it. Well, first of all, the biggest threat to freedom, in my opinion, is not having privacy. So are they highlighting this book I heard called Surveillance Capitalism? Surveillance Capitalism. Now, neither is the so-called mainstream media isn't hyping up that book either. That was a book where the author did some good research and just compiled how these large organizations are gathering all this data on us, and it's aggregated, and then it can be hacked and shared, and it goes right down to all these smartphones and smart devices and little cameras everywhere. Surveillance capitalism. Now, are they highlighting that book? Are they highlighting organizations that are actually calling for us to have more privacy, more digital online privacy? Because there are organizations who are actually calling for that, or actually lobby and work for that. Are they calling for net neutrality to be restored? Something I believe Donald Trump, his administration, rolled back. Net neutrality, the goal is to make the internet more accessible, or so that average people like us have more say over the internet. And it's not just dominated by a few major large corporations. But now let's almost tie that back to the anti-masking as part of the whole thing here, because it is. And people I know who are anti-masking, well, they're also tying that in with some big kind of conspiracy to take freedom away. Well, objectively, in objective reality, a mask, you can argue that, but you could also say, you know what, the mask is actually protecting your freedom. Well, how so? Well, it's giving you some privacy when you're out and about from all these little cameras everywhere. Now, also in terms of freedom, the biggest freedom I think Bernie Sanders talked about is that we are dominated by these large, powerful corporations like fossil fuels, like pharmaceuticals. But are they calling, like Bernie Sanders would be, to, overturn, now I'm going to the United States, Citizens United case? Are any of these outlets even talking about Citizens United, Fox, or those things? Are they talking about it? That's the court case, the Supreme Court case, where they allowed all this money to start flooding back into politics as if there already wasn't enough in it in the first place. So there are organizations that actually work on limiting the power of these vested industries in our government, but these media media outlets that you're listening to are not highlighting that. Neither is the mainstream media, but neither is the so-called standing for freedom outlets. All right, anti-masking and variants, and that takes us to pharmaceuticals. Now, I already told you, look, you could look at masking as a way to retain your privacy, but you know what else? You could look at anti-masking as a way to spread COVID, create more variants, and then we're all right back in the place of needing another booster, another variant, another type of COVID vaccine. Okay, so these outlets are telling you you're standing up to big pharmaceuticals. Not exactly, because what they're not telling you, I bet, and again, neither is the mainstream news media, and this is where we're getting it, or, really Fox is mainstream, let's face it, One American News, these are major outlets. Fox, Rupert Murdoch, they're big time. They're not some small alternative like they're, arg pretending. But okay, I bet they're not telling you about this issue I heard about on Democracy Now! Initially, and that Doctors Without Borders and other. That's that these pharmaceutical companies could share the vaccine formula, meaning they don't have to sit on that patent. They could share that patent with other nations that have the capacity to manufacture that vaccine. And then the whole world could have been making vaccine and been vaccinated with that Pfizer, Moderna patents. But they won't share it. So it's not getting shared, and again, variants can spread. Whether you believe in the vaccine or not, right? Even if you think it's a bad idea, well, these outlets are not highlighting for you that fact that this patent, there are real organizations like Doctors Without Borders and other groups, Public Citizen, calling to have that vaccine patent protection waived and share the vaccine. They're not highlighting that for you. Now, back to the U.S. situation, well, I bet also, because I'm bringing that in because, this movement, this like truck drivers, pickup truck drivers that, protesting for freedom. Well, and that's how they're told they're doing it, protesting for freedom. That's not limited to Canada here. Now, Canada has national health care. Canada prescription drugs are a lot cheaper than they are in the U.S. But I can guarantee you these organizations are not highlighting that within that Build Back Better bill, and something Bernie Sanders in the U.S. has been calling for, is to allow the U.S. government to bargain with the pharmaceuticals so the prices come down. Barely talked about, and I bet dollars to donuts those media organizations are not highlighting that. So who's standing up to pharma here? Now, we heard about, some racist or white nationalists, whatever you want to call it, flags or that kind of thing within the protest. And then you might think, well, how come these people protest and they're allowed to just shut down Ottawa? But when these Native Americans in Canada and in the US for that matter were protesting pipelines, oil and gas pipelines, they're all getting arrested, locked up. Even the so-called mainstream media has barely highlighted some of the brutality around the Dakota Access Pipeline protests and the protests, at least in BC and British Columbia and Canada, by the Wet'suwet'en tribe. Now, some people, like a lot of the natives indigenous would probably feel, and a lot of people would have a more like a race-based analysis and would say, well, this is racism. Okay, I'm not saying it's not that the different treatment of the protesters, but also notice how the media doesn't even pay attention to the pipeline protesters. But I want you to think, if we were back in the 1960s or even the last big time of when there was actually like what I call a true left, meaning, the workers united as like in their class as workers, or the 1890s, and there was a bunch of people of predominantly European looking descent, and they're out there protesting to, the workers should control the factory because they're the workers, they do all the work, and they're protesting like that, and they're waving red banners with sickles and hammers, and they're doing that. Would they be tolerated? Well, they weren't the last round. Instead, there was a McCarthy era, people lost their jobs, arrests, there was all the labor unrest that we never even barely learn about in America. I'm back to America now with that one. But my point here is that it's not really just about race, it's about what interests you're standing up to or unwittingly standing up for. So what about all these, engines idling and trucks and pickup trucks? Well, okay, look, first of all, I've read articles that the majority of Canadian actually, cargo tractor trailer drivers are already vaccinated. So now you got a lot of people with pickup trucks joining in. Okay, why trucks? Why aren't we calling for subcompact drivers to join in? Or how about people with, electric vehicles to join in? Or why not bicyclists to join in? Why is this like pickup trucks? Well, think about the associative advertising with pickup trucks. They have these ads where it's like you're out there in the wild and nature, and you're a farmer, you're a worker. When a lot of people driving pickup trucks are actually, bookkeepers. The modern day pickup has become massive, and it's not really even that practical for people actually working on properties or that kind of thing. They're really too puffed up now, and they're extremely expensive. So you could say, now, how do you get people to support support fossil fuel burning? How do you get people to spend a lot of their savings, a lot of their money, a lot of their income on super expensive vehicles? You create associations that it's for freedom. And here you got them joining in this like so-called freedom convoy. And that's what the auto industry did. They created associations with their advertisements. So, here again, back to this like conspiracy versus false conspiracy stuff. Why are these media outlets, you got the so-called mainstream media outlet, they mention climate change, but they're not letting you know how dire it is. They're not tying back, you're breathing in fossil fuels with there's benzene and particulate matter in there that are causing lung disease and cancers. And they're not barely talking about the feedback loops when there's these extreme weather events, storms, wildfires. They're barely ever connecting it back to climate change. So that's the mainstream so-called liberal media, people call it. But what about the so-called conservative media? They're still airing straight up climate deniers. Oh, it's cycles and all that. And in addition, amigo, they're you want to believe they're garbage cycles and somehow burning tons of fossil fuels is going to do a thing. You want to believe that garbage? Well, I know you don't believe that breathing this stuff in is good for you. There's a place called Cancer Alley in Louisiana where all these petrochemical fossil fuels are refined, and that's barely highlighted. I bet those media outlets aren't telling you Cancer Alley, we got to shut down those petrochemical fossil fuel plants, got to get them under control. The people are getting cancer there. They're not saying that. And it's a little, to know where the money comes from, know what billionaires are funding what stuff. It's a little soon. That takes some real tough journalism, and most of the media is not interested in it. But by prior example, the Tea Party movement, when they were opposing Obama's cap and trade to lower greenhouse gas emissions, it came out there was funding coming from the Koch family, the Koch brothers, which make a lot of money in fossil fuel petrochemicals, saying, hey, you're standing up for freedom against big government, petrochemical fossil fuel money. Public Citizen had a report about different fossil fuel interests who have supported the members of the U.S. Congress that didn't want to certify the election. There's also been reports on all the fossil fuel money going to Trump, petrochemical money. Well, how do you make sense about, the racist or white nationalist element you're seeing? Well, if you're into that, if you're, there's three things really. One, if you're into it. Two, if you're, into this whole conspiracy stuff, but you're saying you're not white nationalist or prejudiced. And three, if you're on the outside of it. So one, if you're into it, my opinion is that that's an age-old tactic to get you to identify as a group, feel that you're in a group that's being protected, but really you're and they're taking your anger about something's wrong, something's not right, and getting you to focus on some other group of people rather than see how we're just trapped in this rat race of buy, sell, buy, we're polluting the earth into the ground. Two, if you're like, you're getting offended because I'm bringing up racism, you're not racist and that. Like, I'm not saying you are, but this is going back to David Duke in the Republican Party. Yeah, not all the Republican Party was supporting that, but he's got a space in there. And now in the QAnon, we heard the QAnon's in there, and there you hear about like space aliens and stuff. There's some far out stuff like that. And I know people who first are warning me about space aliens and they're warning me about Hillary Clinton. And well, let's just think if there were space aliens trying to manipulate the human species, wouldn't manipulating people into supporting burning fossil fuels and spreading a disease, wouldn't that be what a hostile space alien race who's planning on taking over the earth would want to do? Want you to heat up the planet, change the atmosphere, change this atmospheric chemistry by listening to people who say, Green New Deal, blah, blah, blah. Wouldn't they want you to listen to people like that? So what I'm saying is you got to think, what kind of world do you want to live in? I want to get away from this rat race. I want a greener, less polluting economy. I want a more peaceful world. And the only way I see how you're getting there is you got to call for things like a universal basic income, national health care in the case of the U.S. Canada's got something like that now. Some kind of Green New Deal or a focus on transitioning towards a greener economy. And I'm not seeing, and you want freedom, you need privacy, you need limits, some kind of limits on this marriage between these vested, wealthy, powerful business interests and our government and our media. You need some kind of limits on that. And I'm not seeing any of that, honestly, in a serious way being called for in these movements. Therefore, I believe this is at least 80% a false conspiracy aimed at distracting people from how they're actually getting taken advantage of, how our planet's actually being ran into the ground to protect vested industry profits. Well, hey, I hope you found this interesting and useful and at least a little entertaining. In the beginning, I started off kind of funny. And until next time, as always, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. You're clicking that like bell or notification bell. You're clicking that like button, smashing it, they say. And until next time, as always, peace be with you.